that.
You ready?
Okay, you could start. I'm gonna continue and try and win this game, though.
Okay. Welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler. Today, I'm joined by my usual co-host, the wonderful, the eternally young Anthony Marquetta. Anthony, how are you doing today?
I haven't aged in 50 years.
He hasn't. It's pretty disturbing. I think it's because of all those herbs and spices and Prego spaghetti sauce.
You laugh, but also yes.
Today, we are discussing a few things, namely bodies, body horror, and more, because we've been watching some interesting videos about it. A big one has
Hmm.
been leather aprons. How gay were the Greeks and Romans? I think it was. Um,
Yeah, pretty much.
and that's
Leather Apron Club.
Leather Apron Club. I'm gonna find that video and bring it to a link. We thought it was pretty good. I mean, we've already nuked our reach with the first words of our stream, so it's like, let's just go into it. Leather Apron Club, Tim Pool. I don't care about Tim Pool. I just want Leather Apron Club. The
You'd be
ancient
amazed at
Romans
how
were not gay.
those words have been said way too often. I don't want Tim Pool, only Leather Apron Club. Be surprised how often that's been said.
I bet it has. I bet it has been said all day, every day. Uh, but the reason why we're bringing it up is because of these things do interest us. Um, as much as we do care about literature and art, sometimes we just like watching video essays. Um, this one has been
I
one
really do.
we do. This one we've been watching. We shared. I watched Clark Ellison's Horror of Having a Body, which I have some strong opinions about, both because I write body horror quite a bit, um, and also because it there's a certain soullessness that always grabs me when people like want to talk about body horror or whatever. It's like, well, this, and it's like, oh, it's so disgusting to not be in control of your body. And then they bring up women, which always ruins a video. But it's all
Then
right.
they bring, and then they bring up women.
So about those Romans who weren't actually gay. Uh, to me, there's a similar sort of deal. Now, Apron Club has definitely struck me as a Christian. I think he's Christian. I'm not quite sure. Um,
I'm not sure, but he comes off that way.
I might be mistaking him for PaxTube, who does not respond to any of
Is
my
also
quote
good.
tweets. He is pretty good. He's pretty excellent. Uh, but he does fall into the Protestants ruin everything school of Catholic history, and I just don't like it. It's not true.
Tell yourself that, man.
I do.
But I'm sorry. This isn't a Protestant versus Catholic stream.
It's all right. I was open
Anyway,
up
where
to
were
it.
we?
Yes. But with these stuff, it's very interesting for multiple reasons. First off, there's a certain amount of lies that are told in our culture constantly, constant lies about things like whether or not the ancient Romans were gay. And sometimes it's pretty funny, like in Dova Hattie's unbiased history of Rome, where so many characters are gay, way more gay than you should expect. Uh, but also, there's a certain tongue in cheek about it, where it's very clear that Dova Hattie considers the gay experience always superior to the heterosexual one, which is of course the joke. Um, though I think it went over some people's heads for quite some time. Uh, Then you have a whole bunch of other people who say stuff like, well, they were only kind of gay. It's like, we're giving you spoilers for the video, by the way, but you should watch the video because I will not be
You really
quoting
should.
anyone about this stuff. It was only slaves. They only sexually abuse their slaves, and like as if that makes it better. So the homosexual relationship is entirely about, the stronger over the weaker or whatever. It's like, don't ask questions about that stuff. Uh, then you have, people saying, well, you know, as long as you weren't the receiver in the relationship, the catamite in the relationship, blah blah blah, and he goes over quite a few proofs that basically say, no, it didn't matter. Gay was always pretty bad in Roman circles, especially because
Yeah.
if they had any speech insulting anyone, they would probably start it with, so, this gay Julius Caesar, who enjoys Gallic men, wants to raise taxes for Parthia.
So
It's of that level.
here is the problem with this, or at least part of the problem with this, is that I don't think people understand just how weird the modern beliefs on gay people actually are.
So
The
weird.
problem is you don't see anybody arguing about this because it was so obvious.
Yep.
Like, you literally, this is one of the reasons that the Bible doesn't really contain a natural law argument or whatever against homosexuality. They just list it among sexual sins and be like, yeah,
Don't
you
do
know
that.
clearly, right? Like, because of course you know why. Like, why who would even question it? Who would even argue about this nonsense, Like, nobody was expected to argue about it.
Listen, the
And
apostles didn't have Tumblr back then.
yeah, one of the things, though, in all seriousness, in Leather Apron Club's video, he makes this point, and I think he's correct about it, that when you look at, like, the way that laws treated it, the way that people talked about it, it was just an expected and a normal thing in society. You were, like, if you were gay, that was bad. You know,
Mm,
it's like, he goes, there's a
yep.
thing where a bit of a disingenuous thing that people do where they go, oh, well, the fact that they even talk about it at all in a play like Juvenile's play, on the matter means that gayness existed. And he's like, that is a ridiculous straw man or red herring, at least. Nobody is arguing that there weren't gay people at all. Of course, there were people who committed the sin of sodomy in
Right.
every culture, time, and era. The
Yep.
question here is not whether they existed, which, duh, like, nobody would ever say there literally are none. The question here is, did they consider it acceptable? And the answer is just quite simply no, they did not. Like,
Yep.
even frankly, I don't even think that there would have been gay people who would have argued that what they were doing was morally upright. They would have just said that they didn't care.
Yes. This feels good, so I'll do it. There's a lot of
Mhm.
issues of what we would call bodily autonomy that comes up when there are arguments and laws and stuff like that. It's very clear that they viewed it as a crime. It is a crime, to be a pederast as we think of the word. If you rape a young boy, not only are you, harming him, in spirit, he is no longer fit for certain offices in war and stuff like that because he is now an irredeemable, broken thing, which to me has always been a little bit. But considering the damage we've seen with people, who have, gone through stuff like that, no, I understand it, uh, even if I don't agree with it. Uh, you have these sort of, it's a crime against the body. Something horrible happens to these people, body and soul, and it causes them to, be unfit for things like offices, or responsibility, or teaching, or even living. Um, there's, I can't imagine, the horror of it. I have not experienced it, obviously. But, all of a sudden, the change in mindset of what's your normal and so on and so forth becomes entirely untenable. And you lose yourself to the horror of it. I'm not sure what they had, for people for it. I assume they just kind of killed them. But there are many reports of like, rather kill yourself than, um, submit to the shame, which is probably the appropriate response. Um, Not that
Mm-hmm.
most people would advocate for it, but the idea of you choosing yourself and your soul over essentially what your almost devil inspired tormentor expects, is as much of a good reaction to the evil as it is as would be being a passive participant under threat, of course.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I always appreciated Brave New World, personally speaking, more than 1984, because Brave New World always struck me as being the more human story, if that makes sense. And
Yes.
one of the things I appreciate about it is the end of the story when John the Savage and we're gonna spoil like a 50-year-old book now or something.
70.
Uh, yeah, I don't know. I don't even remember. Like it's a very very old book. Uh,
Yes.
but anyway, one of the things I always liked about the end of the story was that John the Savage kills himself. And it sounds weird to be like, you like that aspect of the story, but the answer is yes. The reason that I like that aspect of the story is that I don't know how to put it except to say, like, it strikes me as the ultimate pagan response. Like there is a sense, and it's only a sense, right? But it's not an exact way of doing things. But John did not let the world beat him, right?
Yes.
Now he did, but he didn't, because that is ultimately how a pagan would respond to falling into sin. The Christian response is repentance and reconciliation, right?
Yes.
But John didn't have the Christian response available to him. He literally, like, it had never been presented to him. He never got that option. So he did, in his mind, the only possible thing that could be done to atone for his sin, which is essentially like seppuku, suicide, but, suicide to preserve honor, right?
Yes.
So I always liked that about Brave New World. It struck me as an honest way of presenting the issue, and it also struck me as like, by the light of the pagan, John the Savage essentially was successful in his war against society, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, he was and he wasn't, because I would class it as ultimately, a failure from a Christian point of view.
Yes.
The ideal thing for John to do would have been to repent of his sin, right, and
Mm-hmm.
start again, But there is a sense where we do need to understand that sin exacts a toll. That's the pagan understanding of it, right?
Yes.
And it's a correct understanding. It's just a limited understanding. It's an understanding without the fullness of Christ's forgiveness. Uh, John understood in that story that sin exacted a toll, and so he paid that toll. He did not let society. This is what I guess what I'm getting at. He did not let society tell him the lie that the sin exacted no toll, that
Mm.
there was no debt that needed to be paid. He was wrong in the way that he went about attempting to pay that debt, but he did not let society tell him. He did not accept their argument, right, that they
Right.
tried to make in the book, that he did nothing wrong. He said, no, I did do something wrong, and I am going to pay for my sin. And he does. Uh, this is something that I did always appreciate about Brave New World. And unfortunately, I don't think that 1984 gives us this.
It gives,
Right? It's one of the.
yes,
Go ahead.
it gives us something else. It gives a submission to sin rather than a defiance of it. In the end, Winston sits and drinks his beer and he loves Big Brother. Of course, he doesn't love Big Brother in the sense that anyone would accept as love, but he still loves Big Brother in every way that's the government, society, everything expects him to.
Right,
Whereas
exactly.
in reality, his response should have been, I'd rather die than submit to this stuff. But the thing is that Winston has even less than John the Savage, because John the Savage was at least vaguely some sort of Christian. Not that he was a Christian. I don't really think of
I don't
that.
think that John was a Christian.
No, he was the reason why they called him the Savage was because he was in part of, like, I think it was like Panama or something, where they still had like weird Christian cults that had mixed with Aztec
Yeah, it
kind
was
of
some
thing.
sort of weird indigenous cult.
Yes, but no, what I'm saying is it had it was like a mix of Christian and stuff like that back when artists had, especially liberal artists like Huxley, had no clue, how to deal with Christianity in their science fictions. Um, but no, like, to assume that he comes from it from pure pagan isn't quite right. Like, it's literally the last remnant of religion on Earth, and it's just some cargo cultists.
Yeah, Huxley did mention that Brave New World generally is a story with more hope in it than 1984. Not that that's hard,
I
like
have,
1984.
I mean,
It,
sure, technically. To me,
like he
there's no
always
solution in either.
there is though actually. Huxley mentions this. He says he wrote about this later. He goes, "I wish I made it more explicit, but there is in fact one solution, and that solution is the ex when he's exiled to the Faulkner Islands. He says
Yes.
those places where the people are exiled can actually potentially function as a way out. Huxley wrote about this later. Like he didn't intend the society of Brave New World to be shown as unbeatable.
Ah.
Right? It ended up looking that way, but that was like kind of an accident. Yeah.
To me, there's a hard, sort of limit to that. We mentioned Rome, and we're going to talk about some more about Rome, I'm sure. Uh, always can talk more about Rome, let me tell you. Uh, but in
How
Rome,
often do you think about the Roman Empire each day, Ben?
every minute of every day. But uh, but when it comes to it, like, Roman society was pretty gay at a certain point. It's very clear that despite the negativity they had towards homosexuals, certain points, especially in during the crisis of the third century and extending on until Christianity became dominant, there were homosexual emperors. There were many homosexual emperors. There were emperors with many different sexual deviations, like Valentinian the Great, who is one of my personal heroes because he got so mad at Germans, he burst a blood vessel while yelling at them. Um, it's great. Like, it's like one of those things where it's like he's a total monster, but at the same time, it's like, I admire this man's will here. Uh, so angry he just died. Uh, but his wife convinced him to make polygamy legal, even though supposedly they were both Christians of some nature. Arianism was still kicking around quite a bit. Arianism, by the way, was not ended by the Council of Nicaea. It was, just defeated in a
Of course it
vote.
wasn't. Oh yeah, obviously it was not. In fact, the Council of Nicaea, frankly, didn't even really slow it down for a long time.
Yep.
It provided a sort of stopping point where now people who were not Aryan could point to the council and say, "We are correct."
Yes.
Right, which is a big difference. It's similar. I know that this is from a Catholic perspective, but it's very similar, honestly, to what happened with Humanae Vitae, which is a church document that was released in the 1950s. Now, there was a controversy going around at the time that is still sort of going around today, and this is where the parallel comes on. Of in the Catholic Church, should we allow people to contracept? The Pope put together a commission to discuss the matter. The commission came back. It was an advisory commission. They came back and they told the Pope, who was Paul the Sixth, I think. Uh,
That's about the right time,
they
yeah.
came, yeah, they came back and they told the Pope, we think that in these specific circumstances, the Catholic Church should allow contraception. And he said, "Okay, I appreciate your advice. Thank you." And then he came out and he wrote a document where he said the church does not permit the use of artificial contraception in any circumstances whatsoever. Uh, after the advisory council advised him to explicitly do the opposite of that, it was a big shock, right? And there
Of
was
course.
some, in the immediate aftermath, outrage over it. Uh, but what it did, and it did not slow down the enemy, right, the people who were pushing for it,
Right.
but what it did do, and this is the key point, is that now, whether you are against it or you are for it, you could point to this thing and go, this is the teaching. You can disagree with it, but
Yep.
now what you are doing is no longer saying, I hold this alternative view. You are saying, I am against the church on this view. That's what Nicaea did. It did
Yes.
not slow down Arianism. Arianism was picking up speed. It wasn't even at its worst point, I don't think, though I'm going off memory now. I haven't
Yeah.
looked into it in a bit. But I don't even think it was at its worst point at Nicaea. But what Nicaea did do was it allowed people to stop and go, it is no longer an opinion that there is a debate over. It is now a church teaching, and if you disagree with it, you are saying that you disagree with a decision of the church. And that does make a difference, even if
Mm.
it takes a while for it to coalesce, right?
Right.
And that's what ended up happening. Like it takes a while for these sorts of things to have that practical effect that they're hoping for. It doesn't happen overnight, but
Yep.
it does help.
Yeah, like people are going to choose sin in the vast majority of cases. Like it's ingrained in our nature to do so. That's the reason why the work of Christ in our own hearts is so important. It affects the body. Like these things aren't just a thing of the mind, right? Like you don't just intellectually know. In the case of Humanae Vitae, assuredly, that contraception is wrong in every case. There is a very deep spiritual necessity to it that people who might uh, neglect their Christian faith. And of course, I myself have very Catholic views on contraception, though I should say that in this case, the Catholic view is the appropriate Christian view. Very ecumenical of me, I'm sure. Thank you. Statues may be applied in the back, but the focus of what the Catholics did was not to say this position is up for debate. Like Anthony said, uh, with the stuff that goes on, even though the culture was so degenerate at Rome that even emperors were flagrantly homosexual, and I don't just mean Hadrian. In fact, Hadrian is very exaggerated as a homosexual. But I do consider it very notable that he produced no heirs in that column. Not that that was too weird for even good emperors. Uh, but there, in to bring it back another layer back to Brave New World, there were barbarian hordes that forced out and a religious movement that forced out virtue. So that even though this virtue was fairly lost, from Rome's perspective, there were still things happening that demanded, uh, like a higher state of morals and character and so on and so forth. Even if, the germs were barely barbarians, in fact, there was still quite a bit of reinforcement going on of morality, of character, of not being sexual degenerates.
Yeah, the other thing too about that you start to notice when you really look into these things is how dishonest a lot of it is. Like,
Yeah,
uh, you see it. He also did a video on the ancient Greeks, which was also excellent.
yep.
Like, one notable thing is
I
you'll
felt he didn't
sometimes
go far
hear,
enough, actually, and I mean that in a good way.
yeah, you'll sometimes hear, for example, like Alexander the Great is occasionally looked at as gay because he had a very, very close relationship with Hephaestion, right?
Yes,
Famously and specifically. Of course, the problem with this is very, very clearly there is zero evidence for it. Now, are there people at the time who claim that Alexander was gay for Hephaestion? Well, in fact, there is. There is exactly one reference to it, to my knowledge anyway,
yep,
from contemporary sources, and it's Diogenes. And Diogenes is insulting Alexander. And essentially, the context here is he says something along the lines of Alexander and his little girlfriend Hephaestion. That's it. That's
right.
all we get. It's literally Diogenes. It would be in the same vein of somebody making fun of Barack Obama for having a close relationship with Biden by going Obama and his boyfriend Biden. Like, and then going, see, there's proof that there were people who thought that Obama had a gay relationship with Joe Biden. You
Right.
know, like that's what Diogenes was doing. I doubt even he intended it to be a serious accusation of homosexuality. It was just him disliking Alexander and making fun of him in disgust. You know,
Yeah, like
uh,
famous Greek dick is a dick. Like you can't really
mhm.
like overthink what he's doing. He's being a jerk. Like it's not to give him some deep meaning. Like he's uh, producing a treatise on stoicism. When it's very clear that this was his mo to just insult people. Um, doesn't work for rigorous historical documentation. And it
Yep.
causes a great deal of confusion too, because then you get, like let's say you have somebody with, genuine concerns about their sexuality. Maybe they were abused. Maybe they watched too many anime or something like that. Uh, you know, too deep into the porn. Having somebody say, "Oh yeah, don't you know that these, Roman emperor types, they were totally gay all the time." So it's okay for you too. Like that's what I think is the one the big concern here. It leads other people into deeper spiritual darkness. All of a sudden, people can't be sure, of what they have, of what they are, of what's acceptable, of what other people find acceptable, and then they go down deeper.
Yeah, it's a dangerous thing, and that's why they do it. Though he mentioned this, like that. First off, were they gay in the sense that we would call people gay? Goes even if the people who are making these claims about the Romans are completely correct in everything they claim, the answer to that question would still be no, because what they believed was something very, very different than what is considered acceptable,
Yep.
right? Like, I'm trying to think of how to put, like, one of the main things he points out is that there is a strong running line of utter contempt for men who are the receiver, and I'm going to be very very oblique in these descriptions, right? In a relationship, if you are the female essentially, or act in the way that the female would in the male female dynamic of a gay relationship, then they have absolutely nothing but contempt for you. They are disgusted with you. You can lose your civil rights, and even the pro-gay sources will acknowledge this because you frankly can't. As he pointed out, he goes, "I'm not even cherry picking by pulling these quotes because there is nothing to the contrary,
Yep.
right? Like it is universal." And if you are the male in that dynamic, if you are performing the male act in the gay relationship, uh they just don't talk as much about it, but when they do, it's never positive.
Yep.
Like they just don't talk much about it at all because so what the Romans valued and what they considered very important, which by the way is the norm in most cultures, but what they considered valuable and important was people performing to their roles in society, and your roles were very, very closely connected with your sex. Uh, this is one of the reasons too. Like he points this out, and this is a very important distinction to make. It's not so much, and obviously, so Romans did view women as lesser. Like this is just, it's just a fact.
Yep.
But with that said, this issue isn't so much due to the fact that they looked upon women as lesser. It's that they looked upon men performing the role of women as
Yes.
lesser. Like they did not have any, and like they didn't consider the things that women did, if like women being on the receiving end of a relationship, women wearing women's clothing, none of this was a problem. It was a good thing. It's how
Yep.
women should be acting, right? Like this is the way that a woman was supposed to act. The problem was when men took on the roles of women, and in rare cases, when women took on the roles of men. With the one difference that sometimes women could show manly virtues, and because manly virtues were considered of like the higher quality than the feminine virtues to the Romans, uh, a woman could get praised for this,
Yep.
but even then, it was always in the very abstract sense of certain virtues, not in terms of sexual ethics. That would have been an unthinkable, you know, disgusting, something disgusting, which is
Yes.
something, again, that is pointed out. Lesbians are literally not mentioned by the Romans, like, ever.
Yep.
They just don't come up.
There is some, to be clear, there is some sort of like, men and women had sex with each other sort of mentions, but it's very clear that they wouldn't have gasped at the, lesbian interactions. They would have gasped at the homosexual men. Like that was the crime. Though I don't doubt that if some woman is found in bed with someone else's wife, that I'm pretty sure he could get away with murdering her, quote unquote murdering her. Uh,
Yeah, yeah,
so it's
definitely.
so it's like, yeah, but it's also taking as granted that if he walks in and you're doing anything with your wife, male or female, his wife, excuse me, you weren't in for a good time, assuming you lived through the first 5 minutes or so. Uh, there's also the fact that the language that's used is entirely in the masculine. Like it's like they bring up the guy in another video brings up Sappho. In the end, she's not actually talking as much about women as your feminist professor may think, or some person on Tumblr or whatever, TikTok now, I guess. Uh, Instead, it's very much more like, yeah, this is the only language we had. It's like when they use gendered nouns in a gendered language like Spanish. Guess what? They're still going to refer to you according to the gendered terms that their language naturally produces, according to specifically your original sex. Ultimately, there's a very clear connection between degeneracy and how healthy the soul and body is. Um, one of the things that I do see when people talk about body horror is that they talk about, oh wow, this is gross, their evil is coming out, blah blah, that sort of thing. But few people, almost never, talk about the actual qualities that happen to them. Like they'll have some video about, say, werewolves. Uh, the werewolf has this. Werewolves killing people, eating people. They spent all this time making a good werewolf suit, but there's no inward examination of what's going on here. It's not that a werewolf suddenly showed up and is eating people. In fact, I make it very clear in Pinkerton's Ghosts that werewolfism is more of a spiritual disease that Christians don't have to worry about than it is for something, that it is for something like a viral infection. This homosexuality that the Romans were talking about, that we're talking about from Leather Apron Club, comes through the same way. It's not just about some sort of physical thing, bodily autonomy. It's about the physical and spiritual contagions being mixed together in a way that everyone has to admit to or be in denial of on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Uh, yeah, no, I don't really have anything to add to that. The one thing I would say too that I appreciate about his video is how extensively cited it is. And again, I know I keep harping on this, but it is very important. Like, the dishonesty that is going on is really horrible, I guess is how I would put it. Right? Like, it is incredibly dishonest.
Yes.
Uh like, one thing they mentioned, so you'll probably hear this in some sources with ancient Greeks and Greek pottery. You'll hear that Greek pottery is one of the major pieces of evidence that Greeks had some sort of acceptance of homosexuality. Now, the problem is the examples of homosexuality that we get on Greek poverty, when you actually run the numbers on them, is like well less than 1%.
Yep.
And then when you actually look into the actual pieces of pottery that they are using as examples of homosexuality, you realize is actually way smaller than even that. We are probably looking at maybe a tenth of a percent. And even in those cases, probably because it is portraying some sort of scene from a Greek myth that is about a god losing control and raping a young boy or something, and not any sort of praise or argument in favor of normalization of homosexuality. It's one of the big things. I don't know if you know Percy Jackson and Rick Riordan. I mean,
I
you
know
you
of them.
probably know. Yeah, you know of them. I was a fan when I was in middle school, the original Percy Jackson series, and it is good, right? Like, the original series is a fine series, solid young adult and middle grade fiction. Yeah. Uh, I was one of those people who I was into Greek mythology before I read Percy Jackson. But Percy Jackson got a lot of people into Greek mythology,
Yep.
and did perpetuate a few stereotypes. But I think overall was positive in that regard.
The
Yeah.
cringe that was spread, it was so frustrating. But keep going.
I think it was overall positive in that regard. One of the main, this is neither here nor there on the topic of homosexuality, but one of the main things that it sort of perpetuate as a myth, and though I understand why he did it, is this idea that if you were the son of a certain god or goddess, you inherited the powers of that god, which is completely wrong. And if you think
Yep.
about it for a minute, it doesn't actually make sense because the gods weren't like born with those powers. They have those powers because they took responsibility for that domain of life.
Yes.
So, like, so if you were the son of Poseidon, there is no reason you would have any power over water. Instead, Greek heroes, no matter who they were the sons or daughters of, were just generally considered to be stronger, faster, right?
Yep.
More better fighters than normal people, no matter who they were.
A blessing,
Achilles is the
perhaps, or a curse. You know,
yes. Achilles was the son of a Nereid, I think it was, or a sea nymph.
Titaness.
Uh, what was that?
She was a Titan, wasn't she?
I don't think so. I'm looking this up. Achilles' mother.
Thetis.
Yes.
Sea nymph. Oh, okay, I was wrong. One of the
Okay.
50
So yeah.
Nereids.
Yeah.
Oh, so you got Nereus. Okay.
Nereids. There you go.
Yeah,
So
you're right. My bad.
right, Thetis is a Nereid. She is a very minor goddess. Like very minor. And yet Achilles is talked about in the Iliad, and this is I think the Iliad is pre-Hercules, though I could be wrong.
I
Their
think so too.
chronology their chronology is very fluid, so it's not clear.
From what
But I
I
think he's pretty.
understand, Hercules came in with the Dorian invasion sometime after Homer.
Okay. So, right. Thetis is a very minor goddess, and yet Achilles is talked about as one of, and there are multiple, by the way. One other thing that people don't realize about the Iliad is that there are many characters who are like the children of gods.
Yep.
Uh, in fact, one of the things that makes Odysseus interesting as a character is that he isn't the child of a god. Like,
What?
literally, yeah. You don't agree?
No, no, I know he's not the child of the god. I thought he was like the grandchild of God or something.
He probably is, but the fact that Odysseus is not the child of a god and thus not a demigod, he is favored by Athena, but he isn't in fact a demigod himself, makes him a little bit notable among like the Greek heroes in the Iliad. Many of whom were the children of gods. Like,
Yeah,
so that Odysseus was the son of a sea nymph. Well, yes, that is the
Achilles.
reason that yeah, Achilles. Sorry. Well, Achilles was the son of a sea nymph. Yes, this is what made him such an amazing fighter. But it should be noted that it's not just the fact like he needed to be the son of a goddess to be such an incredible fighter. But also, just because he was the son of a goddess did not automatically mean he was the
Yes.
greatest fighter. He was the greatest fighter because he also just happened to be a great fighter.
Yes.
Uh, and by the way, the myth of his invulnerability arose much later than the Iliad. It's not mentioned in the Iliad, and in fact, if you think about it, it doesn't actually make sense in the Iliad because why would they make him a gigantic shield if he didn't need it? Uh,
Yep.
so the myth of the Achilles heel, while I do think it's a cool myth, I have I have no quarrel with it. It's not part of the Iliad. Uh, but yeah, it's an interesting thing about the Iliad and the Odyssey is anyway, going back to the what I was saying with Percy Jackson is that the original series is a good solid series. I enjoy it. I think it's overall pretty good. Rick Riordan has a good sense of humor. It's fun, well written, whatever. Now he wrote a sequel series to this called Heroes of Olympus. And Heroes of Olympus is also not bad. In fact, it has, in my opinion, one of the best books in his entire cycle of God books, which is called House of Hades, uh, which is about how Percy and his girlfriend Annabeth fall down into the depths of Tartarus and need to fight their way out.
Yes.
And I think it's a I always thought it was a fantastic book, but he introduces something in that book that made me stop reading and buying Rick Riordan stuff. One of the characters from the original Percy Jackson series is a character named Nico d'Angelo, who was the son of Hades, which, by the way, is kind of funny because in real Greek mythology there are uh, no children of Hades outside of extremely obscure
Yep.
gods, like Zagreus, for example, who they elevate in the Hades video game, but in real Greek mythology, the idea that Hades would have children would have creeped the Greeks out quite a bit, I think. Uh,
Yeah, they
anyway,
were pretty scared to death.
they were afraid Hades wasn't an evil god or anything like that, but they had a healthy respect for him. Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway, uh, yeah, like even the rape of Persephone, it's like it all needs to be put into context of the fact that Hades probably treated her better than the vast majority of the gods treated their paramours.
Like
Uh,
in universe, in like
yes,
not even like us interpreting it. Like in universe, you look at the actions that Hades takes with Persephone and you know how he interacts with her and stuff, versus say Zeus and Hera, or
yeah,
you know Poseidon and anybody he gets near, you know, etc. There's a very clear bias that Hades uh, treats his queen quite well. She might also predate him, which I think is kind of spooky, personally.
yeah. So anyway, none of that matters. So there's a son of Hades named Nico D'Angelo in the stories who
Yes.
his sister dies early on, and in House of Hades, an otherwise great book, Nico is revealed to be gay and have a crush and have had a crush on Percy. Uh,
Ugh.
and they introduce a god in that story who was punished because he fell in love with a dude, as they say. All of this is to say that Rorden would probably justify this by saying that he was being accurate to the Greek myths, and Rorden would be lying.
Yep.
Uh, he is not being accurate to the Greek myths. Whenever the Greek myths show homosexuality, it's to show that somebody's lust has grown out of control and dangerous, right? Like, that is when you see homosexual relationships in the Greek myths. It is a
Yeah.
sign that somebody has lost the use of their reason, right? Like,
Yep.
that's what it means. So,
The
yes,
body
it's true.
controls them, not the other way around.
Exactly. Uh, so Nico eventually stars in like his own series where he gets a boyfriend and whatever. This is disgusting to me, and like
They're like
immediately I was like,
12.
I am never, yeah, I am never buying anything by Rick Riordan ever again because that's revolting and evil. Uh, like that's just it's a despicable thing that he's doing. To be honest with you, right?
Yep.
This normalization of this utterly disturbing hedonistic, animalistic sexuality with children.
Yes.
Like with children, it's just it's so gross and disgusting. Uh, and that's the problem with it, where people go like, well, and this is, by the way, my problem with a lot of the conservative rhetoric, where they go like, well, no, my problem with it is that it's not organic to the story. It's like, no, that's not my problem with it. Like, that's absolutely not my problem with it. In fact, if it were organic to the story, that would be worse. Uh,
Yep.
like, which is exactly what we see. It's like, okay, so Rick Riordan has done exactly what you wanted him to do. It's like, you know what? I don't even think it's bad writing in a vacuum, right? It
Right.
is organic to the story, it's organic to the character, and it's disgusting.
Yes.
Like, you should not be portraying this in a positive way for children. You should not, you cannot. And then Rick Gordon just completely goes off the deep end, and he has his Norse series where he's portraying like transsexual characters,
Yep.
where like
Well, don't you know, Anthony? Anthony, don't you know? They found a burial site where a woman had a sword. Clearly. She,
one of my
clear.
favorite things is somebody showed like two men in Pompeii were like hugging each other in a plaster mold, and then it says like I mean, historians speculate if that there was a homosexual relationship here, and it's like, and then somebody just did like a green text that was like B 5000 BC. Your homie, you and your homie fought in the wars together. You saved his life, he saved yours multiple times. You get married, he's your best man. He's there at the birth of your first child. Go, he helps your wife escape when the volcano erupts, right? You
Right.
and him share one last bro hug as the ash settles down, and then it goes like 5,000 years later. Men may be gay, and
Uh,
honestly, as much as that is a pretty good joke, it also shows like the danger in trying to interpret these things, right?
yep.
Like oh, these two men may be gay. Like how do you know that?
Right.
Like you cannot possibly know that. maybe it was a father and son. Like we literally only have their plaster molds, right? Like
We have their burnt, desiccated, volcanic encrusted corpses. DNA? No, we don't even have that. It is literally
yeah,
just, a burnt corpse covered in rock dust. Yeah,
could be a
that's pretty gay.
50-year-old man and his 20-year-old son embracing.
Right.
Uh like we literally have no idea. And then it's like, yeah, they might have been gay. And then it's like it's honestly really, really disrespectful to the people who are there. Like it actually kind of the whole Pompeii thing weirds me out a lot
Yes. Like,
because it's like we're trying to make these guesses about people we know absolutely nothing about and we're acting like we do.
right. And there is, something to say that Pompeii was kind of a pleasure city. Yes, they had tons of prostitutes and all this other stuff, but that's not the same as what we're talking here. What we're talking about is the discovery that, essentially, the choice was long ago made by academics to essentially slander the reputations of what might have been, fine Romans or just general people who are trying to live their lives, who happen to be at the wrong end of a study. There's um, there's a lot to think about it. Like when I write horror and I have a moment of body horror, there's always a question of what is the deeper meaning here. In a story that will come out in a couple weeks, Mother Morrow essentially crawls over broken glass to find Jack, who's been captured by somebody. And that she gets up near somebody else who's holding Jack because she can't stand to be away from him after a particularly hard travail. Is that body horror? I would say yes. Well, what is it showing? It's showing of an internal sickness, a need that is coming out with the actions that are happening. The horror that people want to write doesn't just come from some random bad thing happening. There has to be context. People have to walk off the fairy path. They have to knock over the ashes of a vampire. They have to get bitten by a werewolf. Because quite frankly, I've never accepted a story where somebody's just randomly bit by a werewolf. uh, it's like, oh wow, it just randomly happened to somebody. It's like, okay, there's a certain element of horror. He has to explain how he got a rare and virulent disease in France and at night in the middle of Paris to his parents, and why he has to be chained down once a month. You have so you didn't get it from the Rue Rouge? No, I didn't go there. I was just walking in the fields and a werewolf attacked me. And attacked you at night, you see. She bit you. you know. uh,
Yeah.
you have these things, and it ruins any effect to just have it happen as a random happenstance. Uh, Akira, which was brought up in the thing about horror of having a body, is explicitly going crazy with power. His power is overflowing with him, and it affects his body too. With these questions about homosexuality, looking down on sexual degeneracy, and all we can see once we take ourselves out of it, out of the politics, out of the moral justifications, the immoral justifications, is somebody going, my sexual fetish is right. And the Greeks also participated in it, and you're wrong, and we have one piece of graffiti in Pompeii that says that this guy's given up women. We have Elagabalus, we have Hadrian, and it's like, Hadrian was a great emperor, top 10, easy, top 5, probably. But
Mhm.
Elagabalus? You want to point to Elagabalus as an example, of how people accepted, homosexuality? There are two emperors who were murdered for their explicit homosexuality. He's one of them. The other one is Constance, who was very much flaming homosexual. One of Constantine's children, uh, before he got murdered by um, his revolting armies. Uh, I'm pretty sure they just kind of went home after. It's like, okay, he's dead. We're going back to defending the frontier.
Yeah,
It's
the
mm,
I'm enjoying reading about what people were saying about Oh, wow, I can't say
Elagabalus.
his name. Elagabalus, thank you. Can't say his name. Uh, Edward Gibbon. The quotes about him are pretty funny. Edward Gibbon says that he abandoned himself to the grossest pleasures with ungoverned fury. The name Elagabalus is branded in history above all others because of his unspeakably disgusting life. And modern historian says Adrian Goldsworthy, who I've never heard of, but I'm just looking at the quotes. Elagabalus was not a tyrant, but he wasn't incompetent, probably the least able emperor Rome had ever had. But hey, some scholars write warmly about his religious innovations. I don't know what that means.
he introduced a lot more worship of Sol Helios. Um, However, it was also a time when Christianity was coming into its forefront. It's just that,
Oh, he pulled a that's interesting. So he pulled a Keniten.
yeah, basically. But
Yeah. Wow,
we,
almost exactly. Sun god and everything.
well, that's not hard. Most people did that. Uh, what I mean more of, so like Akhenaten has a certain mystery about him because we don't actually know much more than that, like the bare minimum that is required to understand his heresies. And
Yeah,
like
you
to
will
me,
sometimes.
sorry,
I'm sorry, finish what you're saying
the,
first and then I'll go.
and even though I have no actual idea what Akhenaten actually believed, I always find it weird that the sun worshippers freaked out over sun worship. Uh, and I've always felt that there's been more to that than just ooh, another sun god.
Well, yeah, there has been a long time I don't know if I would call it a belief, but theory that Akhenaten was actually trying to move Egypt to worship of the true God. Uh
Yes.
and is that true? Well, the key here isn't so much if it's true or not true, it's that it could be true, who knows?
Yep.
Which makes it ripe for like fiction. There's a famous book that was made into a movie in like the 50s. I can't remember the name of it. I'm looking right now for the source. It was a novel where somebody wrote and it was like considered a very accurate for the time, which was like, turn of the 20 mid 20th century. Uh Somebody wrote a novel about Akhenaten trying to move Egypt to worship of the true God, and it's considered like a very, very accurate novel, which it probably is,
Yep.
because again, we know so little because the Egyptians destroy anything that they don't like as quickly as possible,
Yep.
right? Like they destroy all records of it as quickly as possible if they don't like them. Uh, we know so little about what Akhenaten did. That's like, did he do this? Well, we have no evidence that he did it, but that he was trying to move people to worship of the true God. But we don't have evidence that he didn't do that.
Oh ho.
So,
Ho
like,
ho ho.
sure, for my fictional novel, maybe, why not?
Yep. And that's why I didn't want to explicitly say that because uh but no, like in Elagabalus's case, it was very clearly not God. Like there's some weird ideas about Akhenaten like we just described, but with Elagabalus, no, there's no question. Um, it is very much not something a Christian can even suspect might be a uh, representation of God seen through a mirror darkly. Uh, no, no, he like Akhenaten is almost entirely not safe for work in every single event that you can talk to him about. about him. Excuse me.
Yeah, yeah, no real argument. It just the parallels struck me as, oh, a guy who came in and was widely hated by the populace because he tried to move worship away from the normal deities to a sun god that he named himself after. Uh, it
Though
is admittedly a very striking parallel.
it is. Though like I said, Elagabalus was guaranteed to be gay, and Akhenaten at least produced children. Um, like as a comparison, he was supremely more gay than Nero ever was.
Who was wow, I can't say that.
Elagabalus.
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 There we go. Yeah. Well, yeah, Nero was just really, really evil. But
Yep.
notably, whenever somebody is really, really evil, people always try to attach that they're gay along with it.
Yep.
Because, because, fill in the blank.
Yes.
Uh,
Because it's an easy attack. It's ad hominem. It's like the American Beauty,
and
where
it's
it's like,
considered a very bad thing.
yes. Uh, ooh, oh, that's what you were going for. Oh my. It's kind
Hmm.
of like how like the version in our time is like everyone's a Nazi, who you don't agree with. Your neighbor next door is a Nazi. Like in American Beauty with Kevin Spacey. It's like Nazis in every closet, and a closet has a Nazi. Um,
Yep.
which does have a certain amount to it, I guess. There was a very high level of homosexuality within the SS elite ranks, as well as in certain, shall we say, very anti-women homosexual ranks in the BDSM type of way. But I will promise our dear viewers that uh, it is not the majority, and it is by no means any connection to, uh, shall we say, reality. These are damaged people with very poor um, decision making skills on the best of days. Uh, mm, like it's pretty bad. Like a lot of those SS guys, especially in the early years, were like basically formed from raped boys who had a lot of bones to pick with society and other things, and were given purpose. Uh, Not that the pink swastika is anything to be believed, but where it's found, there was vengeance on the mind, less than sadism, unlike today.
Hmm. I have nothing to add, really.
Yeah, it's one of those things. Like the deeper I looked, the worse it got, and eventually I just couldn't take it anymore, and I stopped studying it. Like it's just it's sad. It's horrible. Like I can see why some the horrible things happened. You have people who are broken. Their bodies are essentially ripped apart. For a loaf of bread or some money or some time in Weimar, and then what do you have? Well, you still have your soul. Like when it comes to horror and stuff like that, there should always be kind of a soul reaction to whatever the transformation is. Recently, there was a video by Academic Agent where he just went over the roster of the undead. Just seeing like in video games what what every game has and where the overlaps are. Every undead faction in every video game has zombies, for example. Vampires are put above every all the other ones because they're the aristocrats of evil. It's fully implied that vampirism comes soul degeneration. Like, not only do you become a vampire, but there is no such thing as a good vampire. You might have, say, quote unquote, a passive vampire, but you never have a good vampire. The same with other minions who might have some intelligence. They're never good. You can have necromancers who might not be, yes, I will, murder everyone and turn them into my undead horde, but they'll never be good necromancers, at least in the sort of like, raise the dead kind of way. Um, it continues on. Like recently, we saw in Canada that drug users who are addicted are being given the assisted suicide booth as an option. Rather than fighting the addictions, Canada is finding it so much more simpler to take out their addicts and have them shot in the yard, or however those booths work. I do not believe they work anything like what they're said to work, by the way, with the gases and injections and whatnot. But that's neither here nor there. The loss of bodily autonomy, along with the inability to refuse, drugs and stuff like that, even move on to, bodily death, and the choices thereof. It's no secret that Japan has made every perversion under the sun, even things such as the mixing of sex and death, which, has shown up in the past, has spread more and more in many different circles. The idea that we lose control over ourselves and choose death is not some new idea, even though, for example, Guro is very new comparatively. Uh, Rather, it's the culmination of sin within the body, within the soul. The choice in the end is to reject God's creation entirely for a moment of pleasure, or to just do it on a lark. The people who boost these things, I've always felt, have a severe disconnect from what life and reality is. Not quite the worst of the worst, but there's a circle in hell dedicated to them. So you get these things where you see something absolutely rancid, and then the next, comment down is, man, I really hope this forum member being mentioned is okay. They haven't been on Discord in a while. It's like, buddy, you just posted something that would have gotten you lynched in any other century of mankind, even in the worst societies, except for maybe the Aztecs, who would have made you a priest. Uh, how in the world are you concerned for your fellow man? You know, the concern has always felt very strange. Like there's a complete disconnect from the fiction that they're making, that it is no longer just a representation of their soul, but rather a complete destruction of, you know, the ability to create art that isn't absolutely foul and disgusting.
Uh, yeah, no, you went a long tangent there, and I agree with all of it.
Yeah. It's sin nature is what it is. Like there's a complete connection between the sin nature of something happening and body horror. And I don't mean to say that every action that has body horror is evil. I'm saying that, if you have a werewolf, there is a direct connection to the sin nature. In the same way with homosexuals, you see that their sin nature absolutely destroys anything that they have. All of a sudden, they're afflicted with many diseases. It's believed that sperm might have immunosuppressant effect on the body, which is why you get things like gay face. Uh, you have, misery. You have people, forcing themselves to choose love over sanity. Their lusts, being fulfilled by one person, it, confuses the mind, which is already completely warped over what is and isn't acceptable, to the point where it doesn't matter how smart you are, what you have, what you don't have. you believe that the sin you choose is realer than what God has intended for every man since time began.
Yeah, the one thing about horror that is that you should. I'm trying to think of how to put this, and it's hard for me to explain. I almost said like all horror should be a metaphor, but that's not exactly true.
No.
But it gets at something that's closer to what I mean.
Right.
Uh, so like no, it shouldn't all be a metaphor. But what I'm trying to get at is, and you've been like sort of pushing at this idea as well, is that if I'm going to include body horror, it's not just because ooh, when a disgusting thing happens to someone's body, it's really gross and scary.
Yep.
Like no, it's an externalization of something spiritual,
Yes.
right? Like that's what's going on the best versions of this sort of horror. Uh I'm thinking of like David Cronenberg's The Fly. I know The Fly was originally a movie, and then Cronenberg had his version of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
uh, and The Fly is quite gross if you have ever seen it.
Yes. I've seen it. It's a joke, in some places. Oh, the cloning machine was set to Cronenberg hybrid.
Yeah, Croning machine was set to Cronenberg hybrid.
Oops.
I don't understand what the problem is. No, but in all seriousness, I think that The Fly does work as a horror concept. It is a
Yes.
quite horrifying movie. Uh, but what is the spiritual sickness, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, that The Fly is making explicit.
I've never seen the movie.
Hubris, maybe? Yeah. I'm just trying to think it over because as a horror concept, like the idea of The Fly grosses me out. It is quite horrible.
In our next episode of Pinkerton's Ghost, Sean is transformed into a fly.
They've already done it twice. Also, the original Fly's ending is pretty dope too, with the little dude going, "Help me."
That is pretty great.
Uh, yes. Well, actually, no. I'm trying to get off track, so I'm trying to figure out how to explain this properly, and I think
Mm.
I know what track to go on. So we had this discussion. You were there, in fact, in person with John C. Wright once. I don't know if you remember this conversation. Probably not, since it was in person. It could only have been in Chincoteague, Virginia. And when we had this discussion, it was about the John Carpenter The Thing, which is my personal favorite horror movie. Love
It is
it.
pretty
It's a
good.
great film. Yeah, it's a great film. It's my personal favorite. I don't know if I would. I haven't seen enough horror to make any sort of thing like, oh, it's the best. Like,
It's
no, there
pretty
are
much the
probably other
best.
films, but it's up there.
Yeah.
Uh, anyway, so what I said, and I said this to John, was that one thing that always frustrated me when I read about the movie is that people who said it was about paranoia, because I said there is nothing paranoid about the way anybody acts in that film. They
Mm.
all react completely rationally to a very real threat of a shape-shifting monster who could in fact be any one of them. Like, it's not paranoid, it really can be any one of them. They really don't know who it is, and they really do need to treat everyone as if they could potentially be the monster,
Yes.
right? Like, so none of it's paranoid. And John's response was, like, yes, from a logical perspective, right?
Mm.
But when you have a story about a shape-shifting monster who could turn into everyone in science fiction, that always is a metaphor for something else. In this case, probably paranoia. It's just the way the genre works. Uh,
Right.
and I think he is right. Uh,
I
I
can't
think
think of a way to disagree with it.
yeah, fundamentally, I think he is correct. Because yes, when you watch The Thing, which by the way also has some unbelievable body horror in it for the record,
Oh
but
yes.
uh some of the best ever body horror. But when you watch The Thing, you can state, and I think you would be correct in stating, that everybody in the movie, based on the knowledge that they have, is actually acting completely rationally, right?
Mm-hmm.
They know that there is a monster out there who could shapeshift. They know that if they are alone with the monster, they are likely to die. And they know that the monster is incredibly good at imitating other people. Therefore, they need to assume that any time from the arrival of the monster, which was the dog initially, uh, any time from the arrival of the monster to the end of the movie, if somebody leaves their sight, it must be assumed that they could at least potentially be the monster. And indeed, that is exactly the assumption that the cast works under. They start to think, wait a minute, the monster could be anyone. And then they start to treat everyone as if they could potentially be the monster. Now, my point was that none of this is paranoia.
Mm.
Paranoia is when you have an irrational fear that somebody is could be posing a threat, but in reality you don't have any good reason to think that. They actually do have a very good reason to think that this threat is very, very real. So it's not paranoid. It's just rational. It's very rational fear.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the most paranoid thing that any character does, which is the famous blood scene, where they light the blood on fire to see which one of them is the monster. That's the most paranoid thing anyone does in the movie, and it works. It was proven to be the correct course of action to take. So it's not really paranoid at all. Uh, However, I think if I were to take that literal of attack with it, like John said, I would be missing the point of the movie in some way, right? Like, yes, that is very literally true, but part of the power of that movie, The Thing, is that their isolation in an Antarctic, is it Antarctic or Arctic?
Antarctic.
Antarctic, thank you. Yeah, their isolation in an Antarctic base and is starting to cause them to, lose their minds, basically, right? Like, I don't think that you're ever quite supposed to think that, oh, did they just imagine everything that happened? They never go that far in the film. But you are supposed to think, like, if they weren't this isolated, if they weren't with each other this whole time, right? Would
Mm-hmm.
they necessarily be reacting the same way as they do in this film? Was there maybe a better way to go about things? And if they weren't in such an extreme situation, like, could this have been resolved more rationally? And I do
Right.
think you are supposed to consider it from that angle, right? Like, everybody starts turning on each other very quickly because they're all going stir crazy. And now they're going even more stir crazy than they already were because they not only are already stuck with each other for months at a time, they can't even leave each other's sight.
Yes.
So, going back to that and then going into body horror, if you're going to do body horror, you can do just like, oh, this thing is really horrifying because this thing happened to a body that's crazy, right?
Yes.
But I think you're losing some of your, oh no, I almost want to say like some of your advantage as a horror writer if you use
Yes.
it to nothing but that, right? Like, people are expecting you to have something bigger to say here, and you can take advantage of this. And if you don't, you're almost missing the point, right? Uh,
Right.
it goes to a recent story that's going to be, so this is a little teaser for people. The season 3, episode 1 story, right?
Right.
Like, so in my season 3, episode 1 story, Sean is trapped in an office complex, and something that you pointed out that I then tried at least to make a little bit more explicit in edits and things, is the horror of the situation of Sean being trapped in an office complex should be analogous to the horror of being an office drone. And there is a horror to that, right? The
Yes.
horror of your purpose in life is now to do something banal and pointless as a cog in a machine that does not care about you,
Where's your
right?
TPS reports? You
Mm-hmm.
know, you got to have your
Exactly.
TPS reports. Like, hey man.
You're a cog in a machine that does not care about you and now owns you. Now, granted, I do think that some of this is modern people not understanding the purpose of work, right?
Yes.
Because I think that, on one hand, there is a horror to that, but on another hand, that horror could be largely resolved if you keep the correct perspective in mind, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
is, maybe I am a cog in the machine, but I'm only using the machine to make money for my family, which is why God put me on this earth, right?
Yes.
And then once you correctly put things into context, the horror sort of slides away. But that's part of the horror too, right? Like, in the modern world, our priorities have gotten completely out of whack. And it is true, I agree with this as a general criticism of American culture, right? Like, America is particularly bad about this, you know,
Yes.
with our work culture and our way of like, American culture is trying to get you to be dehumanized. That is the point.
Yes.
So, the first story of the season, like, yes, it's about getting trapped in a place and forgetting who you are, but more specifically, it's not just about that. It's also about that horror of losing your sense of purpose and becoming a cog in a larger machine, almost becoming part of a hive mind in a sense,
Yes.
right? Where your individuality no longer matters, and you're not doing something that matters, and nobody cares about you specifically. You just have a job to do, and you're here to do it, and that's it. Uh, Eldritch fan says, "How do you drive an English teacher crazy? Tell her Kafka's Metamorphosis is about a man who literally changes into a giant roach, and he reacts rationally insanely given these circumstances." Yeah, I would actually go as far as to say as that is in fact the point of the metamorphosis. How about that for a hot take?
I actually kind
Uh,
of agree because Kafka had a sense of humor.
First, I know that people really hate Kafka. I actually sort of like the Metamorphosis. It's kind of a trippy book. Uh, And I think that like you said, I think it does. There is a bit of a sense of humor to it. It's a very dark sense of humor. Don't get me wrong.
Oh, of course.
Uh,
There's no question that it's a dark sense of humor. It's just, you know, it is a sense
I
of
actually,
humor.
yeah, I actually do think it's kind of a funny book. But, like, I will also say though, like, Eldritch Fan's point, like, to be honest with you, as much as that's a bit of a troll against English teachers, I also think that that was Kafka's point as well. Like, Metamorphosis is an absurdist book. And because it's an absurdist book, it is literally about, like, I think Kafka would say, if you were to ask him, you go, "What's it about?" He would say it's about a man who turned into a big bug. You know, like, he would, like, that would be his answer if you asked him.
He's a
Uh,
bug in life, and he was a bug, and he's literally a bug now. Ho ho!
yeah,
People still
exactly.
treat him horribly and expect him to go into work.
Yeah. So, does he react rationally and sanely given these circumstances? Yes, but again, I actually think that is the point of the story. He was a bug before that, like you said. His family was using him and treating him like nothing more than what he could provide to them. Now he can no longer provide for them. He's just a suffering soul. And his family's response to seeing him lose his utility to them is to try and force as much of that utility out of him as they could, and when he can't give it to them, to abandon him. Uh, like, that's Metamorphosis. I actually don't think that there is no artistic value to Metamorphosis, as I've seen people say. I do
Wait,
think
people
it has
say that?
something. I've seen it from, especially on the right wing, there are people go, "I hate the Metamorphosis. It's just a pointless story about nothing." I really agree with that. I don't think it's a pointless story about nothing. I think it is. I think it does have a point. I think it is about something. It's about how people can be valued for only what they can give to other people, and not as human beings themselves. Hence, the main character, ironically, he is turned into an animal, right? A disgusting animal, a creature who can no longer provide value for his family, so his family abandons him.
Yep.
But who does his family focus on instead? His sister, who is pretty, who can get married, and by getting married, then she can thus provide indirectly for the family. So why does she have value? Her appearance. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and it is a female versus male theory of value as well, right? Like she is female. So what is and this is also like by the way, Kafka, very based. Uh anyway, so his sister is female, so her main value is not in her kindness. His family, in fact, sees no value to her kindness. Her kindness is hurting them because it is attracting her attention away from doing something that can help them, mainly looking for a husband, right? So it's like, what is the main value of the main character in Metamorphosis? Well, he is a person who cares about his family. He loves them and he wants to help them. However, his family doesn't appreciate this. What they appreciate is specifically and only the things that he can give them. When he can no longer give them things, they turn to the next child that could potentially give them something, which is his sister. Now, his sister can't work, at least not in the way that he could, can't make enough money to provide for them. But because she is pretty, what she can do is marry and then in that way provide for them. Now, she has other qualities as well, positive qualities. She is also very kind. The thing is that her kindness is actually not a positive quality to them because her kindness does not benefit them, right? Like, her
Yes.
kindness, in fact, distracts from what she can do for them. By spending time helping the disgusting creature who no longer can give them any objective value, she is wasting time that she could be using looking for a husband that can provide that value. So, her kindness is essentially, like, not literally, but essentially beaten out of her, right?
Mm.
So that she can go and search for a husband and then he dies alone. I think that there is a very powerful message to the metamorphosis. The message of the metamorphosis is that there are a certain class of people who don't value you as a person, they value you for what you can give them. Uh, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they will go out of their way to make sure that good people who do value people for for who they are and not just what they can give you uh, are turned into cogs in a machine that can serve them.
Yes. It reminds me a lot of how China treats, Good Samaritans. In the end, there's no Good Samaritan law protecting people, who are doing good, in China. For example, if I see a car accident and I run over and start pulling people from it, uh, it's like, oh, thank you, hero. You saved my family. We'll, give you something for, we'll acknowledge you in the newspaper and something. But in China, it's very clear that you're going to get sued. You bump into somebody ever so slightly, it's super huge, mega, financial troubles. Oh, we have so many medical bills, et cetera, et cetera. That are of course faked to all hell. So what you have is a culture that uh, refuses to help each other. If they have it, they'll take it. Uh, a guy was describing a story that struck with me recently where it's like, yeah, he saw a family flip over in a car. So he ran over, he's a westerner, and he ran over and started pulling a child from a wrecked car. Like this car was upside down. There's all kinds of problems that cars have when they're upside down, as you might imagine, for the safety of the occupants and so on and so forth. But his girlfriend, because he was on a date, his girlfriend actually ran up and started grabbing him and pulling him away like he was the one in danger because she knew, his girlfriend being Chinese, that if it's the wrong thing, if it's the wrong person, he will be taken for everything he had as if he was the one who, caused the accident. And this has, of course, been reinforced in their court system and more. So it's not just an idle, oh, look at those, uncivilized Chinese people. No, it's like the very courts themselves have sided with scammers and, uh, people against good Samaritans. So you have, a literal Kafkaesque world that we live in. So it's honestly just better to think, you know, that he did transform into a bug, and that's the whole story. Ugh.
I mean,
He did transform into a bug.
yeah,
And I mean this as a depressing, part of human nature, mankind. That we have to basically say you can't help people in China because they might sue you for helping. Oh, you pulled me out of the car the wrong way, therefore, I need shoulder surgery. When, don't worry about it.
it's also one of those things like there's this big myth that it's the humans are inherently selfish myth is I
Yes.
guess what I'd call it. Uh Particularly you hear people talk about Kenny Genovese is the big one that I really despise the story, and I don't despise the story because of the story itself.
I don't. Yeah.
Although it is a horrible story, but uh I despise the story because of how it is quite incorrectly used. So,
Ah.
if you know the Kitty Genovese story, it's that a woman was stabbed and everyone knew about it, uh, right? But they didn't do anything. Then you actually look into the story, and the answer is they absolutely did do something.
Yep.
Multiple people called the police. Multiple people came up to the house, knocked on the door, and got no answer, and were turned away. And they, and it was in fact the police that didn't do anything. Uh, right? Like it
Yes.
was the police that responded slowly, did not get there in time, and then blamed it on people not telling them when in fact they were told. Something similar happened recently. There was a small tempest in a teapot over this, and lawmakers tried to create a law over it. I think it involved like I'm trying to remember exactly what was it, a rape at a train station or something. Uh,
You got nothing
I
on
think
me.
that was it. Yeah, I think that was it. It was somebody was claiming that there was like a that someone was raped at a train station and nobody did anything about it, and then they were trying to introduce some sort of law like requiring it. So I saw the story and I said immediately, I will bet money that none of this is true. Sure enough, like a week later and very quietly, because they were trying to push through laws related to this, it
Yes.
came out that well actually they did people did go in and try and intervene and they were prevented or something like that.
Yep.
And people didn't just leave someone to be assaulted and not do anything. That was actually all a lie. Uh, and it was a lie that they were pushing to try and push through harsher and more authoritarian laws to, you know, cause get more government power and interference in society.
Yep.
So one of these things, like human beings are not inherently selfish. In fact, if you think about it from just a logical perspective, it doesn't really make any sense. If human beings were inherently selfish, then humanity would die off
Yep.
very quickly. It's the
The
Kantian narrative.
Right. The tragedy of the Chinese stuff I was describing is that there's such a scam culture that even those with kindness are under severe, danger should they actually help somebody in a real emergency. It's not that, in reality, a Chinese person wouldn't spit on somebody if they were on fire. The reality is that if they did so and that person pretended to have COVID, they get sued.
Yep, exactly. Uh, and that the government disincentivizes this as well.
Yes.
Uh, it was something Vox Day mentioned recently where I think he was quite correct about the problem with all of these people who are trying to run society is that there have been in the history of humanity very few societies that have managed to maintain and run large scale civilizations. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
the Christians managed it in the Middle Ages. The Romans managed it. And yes, there were a couple of groups that managed it in Asia. Uh, that is true. The Mongols did an extraordinary job. I would argue, based on at least my knowledge, though I could be wrong, that the Mongols are the greatest empire of all time in terms of power, length, right? Sheer,
Land Empire specifically.
yeah, sheer land, I guess is how I would put it, right? Like they
Mm.
controlled an extraordinary amount of land. This is because Genghis Khan was one of those like singular geniuses in history. You know,
Yep.
uh, primarily he was one of those people who I've classed as great men of history, and and what I would call a great man, which is distinct from a good man, is somebody who is great at war and great in peace. Right? They are great at conquering and great at winning fights, and then in peacetime they are great at organizing and consolidating power. Right?
Mm.
So, uh, the Hannibal was a great man. He was a great general, and then as a politician in Carthage, he very nearly brought Carthage back to glory. But he couldn't overcome the corrupt noble families of Carthage who forced him out of the society. I consider Ulysses S. Grant a great man because I believe that he was a great general, and then as a president, he had one of the most extensive anti-corruption campaigns in American history. Uh,
You
and I
almost don't
consider
believe it.
you almost don't believe it.
Oh,
It's true. Look it up.
I'm sure he did, if you say so, but it's more in the sense of like anti-corruption in America.
Oh, that's
Oh,
well, yes. It didn't work.
of
Don't get me
course.
wrong. But he tried.
Yes.
And that's one of the reasons, in fact, that you'll sometimes see Ulysses S. Grant. People will say he has a bad reputation as president. Well, he does, and that's because he made enemies with all of the wrong people.
Yep.
You know, that's quite true. He, in fact, has a bad reputation as president. Uh, and his bad reputation is because his primary presidential focus was on trying to get rid of as much corruption as possible, and he gave a valiant effort and ultimately failed because it was an impossible task. But he did more than any other president up to that point had ever done trying to end corruption. But whatever. I consider Hannibal a great man of history, and I consider Genghis Khan a great man of history. Now, again, great man does not mean good man. Genghis Khan was, by all accounts, a monster. Uh,
Yeah.
and I believe this. I am not a revisionist when it comes to Genghis Khan. I've heard people try and argue in favor of him. I've never bought it. Like I think Genghis Khan was. Yeah, I take the historical norm on Genghis Khan, which is I think he was a monstrous human being. But
Yep.
there is no denying that he was a genius in both war and peace. In war, uh, he created the largest contiguous land empire in human history in a series of remarkable military campaigns. And then, which is very rare among such people, he actually set up a powerful, stable government to rule it all, and was quite good at it. So, yeah, he was one of the great men of history. He wasn't a good person, but he was a great person. Uh, Yeah, no, that's my thing. And in Rome, I would put Augustus here probably. I think
Yeah.
as I'm thinking it over, I think Augustus counts for this. I think he counts as a great man of history. Augustus is kind of interesting though, because his empire was won for him by his father largely, not entirely. That's not totally
Uncle.
fair. Uncle, yeah, uncle, you're right. Sorry, by his uncle. That's not totally fair. I understand, right? Like,
Right.
I'm being a little bit unfair. He did win his share of battles and things, but a lot of it had been won by his uncle. Uh,
Well, the Empire's land was won by his uncle, but he had to win against his rivals. And people like want to say, "Oh, well, of course Mark Anthony lost. He was a simp." But it's like Mark Anthony had the advantage most of the time. He just wasted it. Or Augustus outmaneuvered him because he simply had better generals on his side. You know,
Yeah.
it's a complicated, like it's not as simple as people want to say. Neither was the Civil War. Like at any
Yep.
point, you know, Julius Caesar could have lost a battle and lost his life. You know, and even at
Oh
the
yeah.
last battles, after everyone was dead except for Labienus in Hispania, like there was still chances for, you know, Labienus to pull out a victory. You know, Pompey could have
All of
won.
these things,
Yes.
right? All of these things, it's like in retrospect, it all seems inevitable when it's really not true. Waterloo is another great example of this. Now, if you look up the battle today, it looks as if the battle was kind of like it was never really in doubt at any point, and that is
Right.
true, sort of. Like, that is true, but it is true because the Duke of Wellington happened to be incredibly well prepared and extremely intelligent in his own right. And
Yes.
he didn't underestimate Napoleon. Like, a lesser general absolutely could have lost Waterloo. Like, and
Yes.
I don't mean a bad general, I just mean like an average general. Like, yes, Waterloo was never really in doubt at any point, but it very easily could have been in doubt if you didn't have someone anticipate literally everything that Napoleon was going to do in advance.
Yep.
Uh, because that happened, it looked as if there was no way for Napoleon to win the battle, but that's sort of a half truth. Like, there was no way for him to win the battle against the Duke of Wellington because the Duke of Wellington predicted everything Napoleon would do. But if he hadn't, or if it had been someone besides the Duke of Wellington who was not capable of it, then
Yep.
really it it could have gone worse. Uh, and there's more here too, where you go to like Augustus and Julius Caesar. It's the same thing. It looks inevitable. Even the Civil War is a great one. That's one of the reasons I did the Gettysburg stream. One of the things that I realize is that, like, he makes the point a few times that we don't really know what would have happened if Lee had won at Gettysburg. Like, it is not, don't get me wrong, Gettysburg wasn't an automatic win condition. It's not like if Lee had won Gettysburg, it meant he would have won the war. But what it did mean is that if he had won Gettysburg, he might have won the war. Like,
Yeah.
like it was that big,
Like
you know.
like it's not that it's automatic win like you said. It's that the chance is still very high. You know, he still had to win more fights. But all of a sudden, you know, he's not just going to fight, you know, troops that are like, yeah, we won at Gettysburg, so we'll win here. He's like, oh man, you know, he'll fight troops that are like, oh man, we lost at Gettysburg, we're going to lose here. You know, Robert E. Lee's unbeatable. You know, et cetera, et cetera. Like
Which was
the,
pretty much the feeling at Gettysburg.
yep,
The thing about Gettysburg, too, that I did not realize is that, again, Gettysburg is a battle that if you study it on a larger scale, it's like, of course the Union won that battle. There was no way that they couldn't win that battle. Everything about it pointed to the advantage being in the Union's favor. Yes, that is correct, right? Like,
right,
there is no doubt that is definitely true. However, I don't think people understand just how close the Confederacy came to winning that battle. On three separate occasions, the Confederacy was like a hair's breadth away. In particular, in my opinion, and this is well known, so it's not like a new thing, but the closest that the Confederacy came to winning at Gettysburg, and what made Gettysburg so interesting is that basically the Union was in an almost invulnerable position on Cemetery Ridge, but because they had to entrench themselves in that position, if any one part of it fell and allowed the Confederacy to gain a foothold, the Union were sitting ducks and would all completely collapse, right? Like,
mm,
so you had this really weird dynamic where it was extremely difficult to gain a foothold against the Union, but if you managed to gain any foothold at all on the Cemetery Ridge line, then the Confederacy was probably going to win the battle, right?
right.
So you have at one point of the battle. Now there's the famous Little Round Top fight, and it is true. They came very close to winning at Little Round Top, specifically at the point where Joshua Chamberlain's 20th Maine fought an absolutely brutal battle and won with a famous bayonet charge down the hill after running out of ammunition. That was all real. It did happen, and it was close. But truthfully, the South was pretty hard pressed to win at the Round Tops. Uh, it did take some heroism from Joshua Chamberlain's 20th Maine, but it was always kind of an uphill battle. Quite literally, an uphill battle. Uh, However, there was another point in I can't remember the exact location, but in the center of the line where uh, General Hook, General Hancock, rode over to the battle and realized in horror that he had left this place like without enough reinforcements. He had moved them to other areas, and he's watching this battle and says, "Oh crap! In 5 minutes, we're about to be overrun. If we're overrun, they take the section of the hill and they set up artillery. Then we're dead and we're gonna lose." So, and he realizes that he needs 5 minutes to bring in reinforcements. So we're at this point in the Battle of Gettysburg where the entire battle hangs on whether the Union can hold the line for 5 minutes while Hancock gets reinforcements. So, very famously, Hancock points to the head of the first, I want to say Minnesota, the first Minnesota Infantry Regiment and Volunteer Infantry Regiment, and points to the flag of the charging Confederates. I think the Arkansas Brigade or something like that. And he decides that he's going to do whatever it takes to gain his 5 minutes. And he tells the men of the first Minnesota Volunteer Infantry, "See that flag?" And they go, "Yeah." And he goes, "Get that flag and bring it back." Now, the 1st Minnesota Infantry Regiment knew exactly what this was, which was a suicide charge. It was a suicide charge to buy Hancock time to bring over the reinforcements. And I think 87% of the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment was killed in this charge. And they did not get the flag, but they got Hancock 10 minutes. And Hancock brings over enough men to hold the line. So, like, think about this for a moment, though, because, like, it really struck me when I was reading this story. It's like you can make the argument that the entire Civil War, like, this entire 4 or 6 year struggle, right, between the North and the South, hung on 5 minutes in the middle of the Battle of Gettysburg, right? Like, it only seems inevitable in retrospect. It does not seem inevitable at the time. Same thing with World War II, right? Like, people will say the same thing. Like, it is worth noting in World War II that on the larger global scale, the Allies never thought, never at any point, did they ever think that they would lose World War II. It's kind
Yep.
of fascinating to read about in retrospect. Like, even at a point in the battle before America had joined, when Britain was basically the only group fighting, they had run they had run the logistics. They knew that Germany did not have the men or the arms. And when they met, like when the Allied leaders met, along with Roosevelt, who was technically not an Allied leader yet, but was going to be, at like the Potsdam Conference, they were not discussing, they never discussed anything like surrender protocol. Never, at any point. Instead, what they were discussing was how they would remake Europe after they won. Because they never seriously considered the idea that Germany could actually win the war.
Yep.
Now, on one hand, they ended up being correct, right?
Mm.
On the other hand, it's like they ended up being correct, but to say that they had to be correct is something I think you can only say in retrospect.
Yes.
Dunkirk is, of course, the big one, right? Like, Dunkirk very, very nearly became an absolute disaster. Uh, if the British Army had been systematically destroyed at Dunkirk, as came close to happening, would Britain have had to start negotiating a surrender against Germany? I doubt they would have.
But
Probably what they
yes.
probably would have done is basically forced America to get into the war sooner. And I think that's what would have happened.
Yeah. Because it was always inevitable that we would, because Roosevelt was a tyrant, and quite frankly, uh, the people who wanted basically nothing to do with another damn fool European war were not the people who, had power over the nation. Um,
Yeah,
it's
Roosevelt was insistent that we were going to war,
yep,
and I don't know. I still lean towards we probably did have to eventually, but
sure.
it's hard, right?
I'm of the
We're looking
opinion
at it.
that Hitler would have been assassinated within, like, 3 years of quote unquote victory. Like, or he would have,
Oh, 100%.
you
I
know,
mean, they had tried to assassinate him like three different times during the war. Uh,
yep,
that's the thing. The other thing, again, like that Vox Day points this out, and I think he's quite correct about Hitler. It's not so much even that Hitler was evil, though he was. Hitler was a horrible leader.
yeah,
Uh, like people think he was good because yes, he did restore Germany's economy for a brief period of time before he went to war, but the fact that he made Germany go to war was absolutely idiotic. He never should have done it. It was not like we said. It seems only like an unwinnable war in some ways in retrospect, but on the other hand, if every enemy leader is always throughout the war insistent that there was never any serious way that they could lose, like that should be a sign that maybe this is a very bad idea, and
yep,
he forced it onto his country anyway, and he got Germany destroyed. Uh,
yep,
so Hitler was a horrible leader. He would have probably been assassinated because he was also going increasingly insane as the war went on. That is real. That's not propaganda.
yep,
That absolutely is real. Like
yep.
he was addicted to drugs. He was into some like I don't think he was really. There were some Nazi high officials who were into occult stuff. Hitler had some sympathy for it, but he wasn't really into it.
Right.
However, he absolutely was into drugs. Like that is a
Oh
real
yeah.
thing.
Like
Uh,
the occult thing, like you have to, like, people don't seem to understand that there's like an artist corollary. Every artist has a certain amount of sympathy for quote unquote occult or occult like things. Like, it's not, you can't just look at it and go, oh, he was into the occult because he really believed that he could get the spear of Longinus to. No, he liked it because it tickled his artist brain.
there were Nazis who really did want to bring back the Norse religion, and Hitler just sort of tolerated them, but he did not like them.
Right,
I want to say like Himmler wanted to do this, and Hitler just considered him like an idiot. Hitler, I think, just considered him kind of an idiot. But
right.
like he didn't really, but he didn't actually do anything to stop it. But he didn't really believe it either. But like Himmler was all in on this idea of like, yeah, we're gonna bring back the ancient Norse gods, and Hitler was in the background going, that's friggin' stupid. Uh,
How
right.
many marks have we spent on this? What?
Yeah, but then it's just like whatever makes you happy. Um,
Yeah,
and the other thing too is that like the Holocaust is honestly probably one of the major reasons that they lost the war. Would
yep,
they have lost the war without the Holocaust? Yeah, they probably would have, but it did not help things. They wasted a tremendous amount of resources on this,
yep.
like an absolutely insane amount. Somebody pointed out, like Vox Day posted that great, and I know I'm very Vox heavy today, but oh well.
Yeah,
Uh, he posted that great article about from the historian who was going like how the Germans lost to Russia. And one thing he points out, he goes, so after they did have control of Ukraine and the farmlands in Ukraine, and the Nazis sent the Ukrainians to concentration camps. And they said, so the question is, would it have made a difference if the Nazis had went in, came to the Ukrainians as liberators from their Soviet oppressors, which, by the way,
they
they
were.
absolutely were oppressors to them,
Yeah,
and gotten the Ukrainians on their side, making food for the Nazis? They said it would have made a difference, but it's also almost like missing the point to ask that question because it's to ask what if the Nazis weren't the Nazis,
yeah,
right? Like, what if the Nazis acted in a way that was completely antithetical to Nazi beliefs and practices? And like, yeah, that would have made a difference, but they also might not have invaded at all at that point. So,
Yeah.
you know, uh, like they were always going, and that was sort of all the problem as well. Uh, incidentally, the reason that the Germans lost in Russia is because if you want to talk about an unwinnable war, Russia is the Nazi war against Russia is kind of the classic example of this,
Right.
where like Russia, they did everything right against Russia. Literally, they did almost as good as an army could possibly do in Russia, winning absolutely stunning victories, vastly outnumbered over and over and over again, without realizing that they had gotten into a literally unwinnable war. Like, it's kind of a fascinating test case because we now know what that looks like. Like, what is an unwinnable war? An unwinnable war is when you can win every single battle and take entire armies over and over and over again, destroying factories, taking farmland, and still not win.
Yep.
Like, that's an unwinnable war. So that's what Germany got into with Russia. And it's kind of a good metaphor for World War II, right? They said it was also one of the all time great logistical, I think they called it like one of the all-time great logistical mistakes of all time in history, is that the Nazis estimated on the high end that Stalin would have something like, I keep forgetting the exact number, but I want to say like something like 74 reserve units, and he
He
had
had like
instead something like
500.
eight, yeah, I want to say like 700 or something
Yeah.
reserve units. And they said like this is, they go, it honestly is so wrong, like it boggles the mind, like this is one of the all-time worst logistical mistakes in the history of warfare.
Yeah. And it's
And
like,
they said,
mm.
yeah, go ahead.
And to be fair to them, of course, Stalin was also trying to invade them. They just got to the hit first. It's pretty clear from everything that there's there that not
Oh
only
yeah.
like everyone was making the best decisions that they had the cognition to make. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, no, that sounds pretty dumb. But also, I'm just a writer in an apartment uh, who's talking about this stuff. I don't know anything. What I do know is that, in the end, if I wrote this into a character, they'd be like, "You're making this up."
So
It's like,
it's not so much that attacking Russia was the dumb, like the way that they did it, the fact that they got the numbers wrong on that scale. Like the question, it's not so much that attacking was the mistake is the way that they figured out that the their estimation of how powerful the Russian forces were was off by many orders of magnitude. like
mm-hmm,
like not even close.
yeah,
And some credit to the Russians too. Like there's also, the level of the Russians ended up being kind of a harder fighters than they expected as well. Like there is that aspect to it. Don't get me wrong. I don't mean to disrespect the Russian soldier in this sense, right? Like famously the Battle of Stalingrad was an absolute bloodbath.
mm,
But the article that I read was like people make a big deal out of the fact that they got in sight of Moscow, but he goes like this is all a red herring. They go as if like by touching Moscow soil, you've captured the flag and you win. They said the truth is it didn't really matter that they were in sight of Moscow. The war was lost by that point anyway. The war with Russia, I mean. The
yeah,
invasion had already failed. They said, you want to know what would have happened if they had gotten to Moscow? Then they would have had to fight in the streets of Moscow. Like, do you think that Moscow would have just surrendered? They said, of
no,
course not. It was already. They said, I guess it's an interesting historical fact that people with binoculars could see the Kremlin in the distance, but it's ultimately an academic fact. Like, the fact that the Kremlin was in the distance didn't change anything. Uh,
right,
like, they could have reached the Kremlin and they still would have lost the war. Uh,
yeah,
because the big problem is that they did in fact have the best army in the world with the best generals in the world with the best fighters in the world, but that they did not have is enough people to win this war. And it did not help that whenever they conquered an area, they treated the people who they conquered like garbage.
Yes.
Yeah, so they weren't going to get new people to fight to join them in this war. And again, this is like it's almost an academic question of could they have won if they treated them differently? Well, yes, but then they wouldn't be the Nazis anymore, would they?
Right.
Like, you know,
It reminds me of
then
a story. A Roman general called Lucullus was known as a gourmand, and so he threw all these feasts all the time, and he had this power, this great chef, and so on and so forth. So so there comes a time when it's like, oh, it's just me. I wonder what the chef will do, and the chef pulls out, a very plain meal, fit for one man, a general. And the Lucullus calls his guy over and he goes, What's up with this dude? Like, usually you do all these big parties, all these different things. And he's like, Well, I thought you were dining alone. And then he goes, Lucullus dines with Lucullus. Let me make sure I got that quote right. Don't you know that Lucullus dines with Lucullus? So it's like, yeah, sure, Lucullus was eating alone, but at the same time, it was still Lucullus.
yeah, exactly. Like to say that the Nazis could have won the war by, treating the people that they conquered with some level of humanity and perhaps bringing them into their larger fighting force is to say the Nazis could have won the war by espousing a philosophy that was not Nazism,
Yeah, right.
which, like, yes, I guess,
Sure.
but who's to say there even would have been a war?
Right. Different things would have happened. The necessary qualities wouldn't be there in the same way. Uh, like it's like, yeah, sure, there were probably generals who could do that in the Nazi ranks, like Rommel or something. But at the same time, it's like, you know, he wasn't really a good Nazi. It's pretty clear that you have a choice between, Nazis and not Nazis. In the same way that a lot of people, have that choice between, spiritual darkness and Christianity. Could Christians say, accept, sexual immorality? I mean, sure, but they wouldn't be Christians. They wouldn't be anything like Christians. All this stuff that's talked about is faff. It's you know theory into the breeze. Aliens didn't invade. Several authors, from the 1970s who used Nazis extensively in their work, are foaming at the mouth on Twitter, especially that one guy who had that alternate world thing. And it's very clear that they have no understanding of anything historical, even if they happen to live through it. Like it's so blind because they've chosen a different religion. They're trapped in something that they have to shill for because the other option is to accept Christianity. We see all this stuff online about this and that and end times and non-end times and what's going on, but quite frankly, it's not the end times until it's the end times, and Christ will deal with it when Christ decides, not before, and not in any other way. Um, and that to me is part of the essence of body horror. In the end, it's something that is natural, is God made, has that connection between body, soul, spirit, and in fact, it's being destroyed, disrupted, marred. God's creation is being marred. You could say willfully being destroyed, or destruction is being forced upon them, or destruction is being willingly accepted from an outside source. In the end, this body horror stuff is unnatural and is a direct representation of the sin nature. In a way, I don't think most horror really captures, at least in the same manner. You do see it in things like Something Wicked This Way Comes, where, the temptations strike at the very heart of things. But no, I can't, the temptation to be young again so you can play with your son. I see that, I understand that. but that's not the same as body horror. This stuff isn't the same as what people want to read in the story. In the end, the choice. I keep saying in the end for some reason. I shouldn't have said end times. It's got me in the mindset. Uh, these people have to choose something, and many times they do not choose Christ. And it's very clear in the Bible that the flame doesn't end and the worm doesn't end. And the idea that everyone's in hell on fire and worms are burrowing in and out of their soft flesh and even perhaps their hard flesh is certainly a horror that should keep every Christian up at night uh, unless they spread the gospel. Hmm. Got anything else for us, Anthony?
I think that says it all.
Excellent stuff. Thank you, guys. We'll have something for next week. Sometime soon, we'll do another Christian versus Protestant. Thank you. Hello, Vanessa Vaquez. Hello, Eldritch fan Aaron VT, Mr. R. Um, Hope you guys join us next time for what we got, uh, which we will tell you. We'll certainly check out Aaron VT's suggestion of the Ballad of the White Horse. Thank you all, and we hope to see you on the next one.
So